In this video, I want to talk about the subject of slavery in the Old Testament. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because atheists love to attack the Christian faith and love to attack the Bible by pulling out these isolated verses and saying, look, in the Old Testament, God allowed people to own slaves and God allowed people to beat their slaves as well. And they say, how can you worship an evil God like that? And how can you expect me, they say, to worship an evil God like that as well? And so what I want to do in this video is I want to look at those verses, but I don't just want to fall into the trap of looking at those verses in isolation. I want to look at a few other verses and kind of paint a bit more of a picture of what the Old Testament says about slavery. And as we go along, we'll look at these verses that atheists love to use. And I want to begin by reading to you two verses from Deuteronomy chapter 23. It's verses 15 and 16. And I doubt very much that an atheist will read you these two verses, but I think they're very important to read if you're going to study the subject of slavery in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 15 and 16, and it says this: "You shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you. He may dwell with you in your midst in the place which he chooses within one of your gates, where it seems best to him. You shall not oppress him." Now, this is a fascinating passage of scripture because here we learn that the nation of Israel was a sanctuary for runaway slaves. If you were a slave in a foreign nation and you managed to escape your master and make it to the land of Israel, you would be free and you could live wherever you wanted in the land of Israel. This was the law that God gave to the people of Israel. Now, when you look at the other nations around Israel, they actually had extradition treaties and bounties and so forth, so that foreign runaway slaves would be returned to the original nation from which they ran away and returned to their masters. But Israel was very different. Israel was a sanctuary city and a safe harbor for runaway slaves in the ancient world. This is, to me, just amazing that such a law would exist in a world like that. To me, this is proof that God is the one true God. This is proof because there's no way they would have come up with this on their own in those days. Another passage of scripture that's worth looking at when studying this subject is Exodus chapter 21. We'll look at a few passages in Exodus chapter 21, but at the moment we'll just look at verse 16. It says this, Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, "He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found at his hand, shall surely be put to death." Now, if this was the law during the period of time when Africans were being kidnapped from Africa and sold as slaves throughout Europe and America, if this had been the law, then all of those slave traders and all of those slave owners would have been put to death. Why? Because it says very clearly here that if you kidnap somebody and sell them, or if you have somebody who is kidnapped in your possession as a slave, then you're to be put to death. That's the law. That was the law in Israel. So when we think about, slavery in the Old Testament, clearly we're thinking about something that is totally different to what we think of when we think about slavery today. So what was slavery like in the Old Testament? Well, to understand that, we need to look at Leviticus chapter 25. And there's two kinds of slaves that you could have during the Old Testament period. You could have a native-born Hebrew slave, or you could have a foreign slave. And there were different rules for these two different kinds of slaves. However, if you were a foreign slave in the land of Israel, you could, and I'll show you this later on, you could reach the status of a native-born by participating in the Passover. If a foreign slave was to participate in the Passover, he would automatically receive all of the rights of a native-born Hebrew slave and eventually receive his freedom. Now, we need to understand all of this in context, so let's just begin by reading Leviticus chapter 25, verses 39 through to 43, and it says this: "And if one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you unto the year of Jubilee. And then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers, for they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God." So here in this passage, you can see that if you were a poor Hebrew, if you were a poor Israelite and you couldn't support yourself, you could sell yourself into slavery, but they were not to make you do slave labor. They were to treat you like a hired servant. and you could work until the year of Jubilee. Now, you didn't have to work until the year of Jubilee. If you go to Exodus chapter 21, verse 2, it says, "If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing." But the reason why this passage says that he could work until the year of Jubilee, which was every 50 years, is because when the year of Jubilee came, all of your previous possessions and all of your previous land was returned to you. So a poor person who had sold themselves into slavery would no longer be poor. They would now have land and they would be able to plant crops and sustain themselves and so forth. So by law, you had to be set free after 6 years, but you could continue on unto the year of Jubilee if you just couldn't, continue to provide for yourself, and so you needed to continue serving as a slave. But it's worth noting that after 7 years as a Hebrew, they would have to let you go. If you wanted to go free, they would have to let you go after 7 years. Now, atheists will point out, well, that's fine for the Hebrews, but that's not the case for foreign slaves. And it's correct. If we look at the next few verses 44 to 46, it says this, "And as for your male and female slaves whom you may have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. And you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigor." Now, this passage does make it clear that foreigners could be purchased from the nations around the nation of Israel, and foreigners who sold themselves into slavery within the nation of Israel could also be purchased, and they would become the perpetual possession of their slave owners. They would be owned for life, and they could be passed on to the slave owners' children as part of the inheritance. That makes it pretty clear. However, these foreigners, if they were to participate in the Passover, which was every single year, they could move from this category into the category of being a native-born Israelite slave, because if a foreigner was to participate in the Passover, they would automatically become as though they were one of the Israelites born in the land. Let me prove this to you. If you go to Exodus chapter 12, and this is as the people of Israel were leaving the land of Egypt. God had killed the firstborn of all of the Egyptians, and the people of Israel had celebrated the Passover. They were about to leave the land, and there was a huge group of Israelites as well as a mixed multitude that was leaving with them. You can see that in verse 38. And then Moses begins to give regulations from the Lord for the Passover in the future. And verse 48 of chapter 12 says this, "And when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it, and he shall be as a native of the land." Now, this is very clear that if somebody who was a foreigner dwelling in the land of Israel was to participate in the Passover, he would automatically become as a native in the land, and he would have all of the rights and privileges and immunities of a native-born Israelite. Now, you might say, well, that might be just talking about foreigners who were free. Well, if you look at verse 44, it says this, "But every man's servant," and the word servant here in the Hebrew is the word for slave, "for every man's slave who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him," that implies is a foreigner, "then he may eat it." So a foreign slave could actually participate in the Passover. He didn't have to. He didn't have to participate in the Passover. He didn't have to turn to the Lord. But if he did, if he turned to the one true God and participated in the Passover, then he would become as a native-born Israelite and receive all of the privileges and immunities that a native-born Israelite had. Now that means, if we go back to Leviticus chapter 25, he would then move from the category of being a foreign slave to the category of being a Hebrew slave. And as soon as he did that, he would then, first of all, he wouldn't be able to be treated as a slave. He would have to be treated as a hired servant, and he would be able to receive his freedom after 7 years. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. Imagine you're a slave in Babylonia or Assyria, and you're about to be purchased by an Israelite and taken back to the land of Israel. I think that every single slave in those regions would want to be purchased by this Israelite, because if you were purchased, you had an opportunity to turn to the one true God and receive your freedom. And immediately you would no longer be able to be treated as a slave. You would have to be treated as a hired servant, and he wouldn't be able to rule over you with rigor, as it says in the passage here in Leviticus. So to me, this is an incredible blessing. Any person who was a slave in Babylonia and Assyria would consider it an incredible blessing if he was purchased by an Israelite from the land of Israel. And they might say, well, why didn't they just, purchase them and set them free straight away? Well, it wouldn't have been practical, right? It just wouldn't have been practical. How would, these Israelites be able to purchase all of the, slaves and everything like that and just set them free? They wouldn't have had the money to do that, right? It's much more practical to allow the Israelites to purchase these slaves, and then those slaves in turn have the opportunity to turn to the one true God, participate in the Passover, and eventually receive their freedom. If we go to Exodus chapter 21, we read that there's this one passage of scripture that atheists love to use to attack the God of the Bible. It's Exodus chapter 21, verse 20, and it says this: "And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property." Now, this is probably one of the most difficult passages to explain when it comes to the subject of slavery in the Old Testament. I think the first thing that's worth noting is that nowhere in this passage does God actually approve of slave masters beating their slaves. I think it's important, right? There's nothing here that says that God approves of this kind of thing. It's simply that God is regulating a practice that was already there in the ancient world. So that's the first point. Secondly, notice that it says here, if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod. It's not talking about a club or a lethal weapon or a sword or anything like that. It's with a rod, which is generally an instrument used for punishment. And slaves in the ancient world, whether we like it or not, were generally punished because they refused to work, or they stole something or assaulted someone, perhaps sexually, that sort of thing. Slaves were generally punished for those kinds of behaviors. But God is regulating that kind of punishment, the kind of punishment that slave masters had at their disposal. And he says here that if a slave owner, beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Now, the word punished here in the Hebrew is generally associated with capital punishment. So the slave owner would be put to death in this particular situation. And if you look at verse 12 of the same chapter, a few verses earlier, it says, "He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death." So clearly when it talks about punishment here in verse 20, it's talking about capital punishment, which was generally the punishment. It says it in the book of Genesis, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Okay, so it's obviously has to be judicial punishment. It can't just be revenge, it has to be judicial punishment. But if a slave master beats his servant and that servant dies under his hand, that slave master will be put to death. He'll be tried for murder. And then it says this in verse 21, "Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property." Now, before I explain that part of the passage, it might be worth looking at verse 26. Verse 26 is interesting because it talks about a slave who is struck by his master. And it basically says if the slave receives any kind of permanent injury of any kind, then that slave is to be set free. Let me read this to you. It says this: "If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth." So this is saying that if there's an injury, just even a missing tooth, when a master strikes his slave, that slave immediately receives his freedom. And I don't think it's limited to eyes and teeth. I think this is establishing a principle. If there's any kind of permanent injury, if he loses a pinky, if he has a scar, permanent scar perhaps, that slave is to immediately be set free because of that injury. And so when we look back here, and we see these are pretty full-on laws when it comes to owning slaves and punishing slaves and regulating the kind of thing that masters can do. If he beats his male or female servant and he dies, then that master is put to death. If there's any kind of permanent injury, then the slave is set free. I think, these are pretty good laws. But what about this part where it says, "Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property." I want to read to you from the Expositor's Bible commentary on this passage. Since the slave does not die immediately as a result of this act of using the rod, not a lethal weapon, however, but tarries for a day or two, verse 21, the master is given the benefit of the doubt. He is judged to have struck the slave with disciplinary and not homicidal intentions. This law is unprecedented in the ancient world, for a master could treat his slave as he pleased. The other thing is this: just because a civil magistrate was not able to punish a slave owner for striking a slave and that slave dying 2 or 3 days later, that doesn't mean that God didn't know what really happened and that God wasn't able to punish him. For example, if you go to the book of Job, Job says something very interesting. Job chapter 31, verse 13 to 15, it says this: "If I have despised the cause of my male or female servant when they complained against me, what then shall I do when God rises up?" And when the Bible talks about God rising up, it's talking about him rising up for judgment. Then it goes on, it says, "When he punishes, how shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb?" Now this is really interesting because Job is saying here that if he despises the cause of his male or female slaves, or he mistreats them, then on Judgment Day, God is going to rise up to punish him. That's what Job is saying here in this passage. And so we need to understand when we look at the law of Moses that they were civil laws and they dealt with civil matters. They didn't deal with the eternal consequences for sin. So just because a slave owner may have perhaps in some situations gotten away with beating his slave and was given the benefit of the doubt that he didn't actually kill the slave died 2 or 3 days later, perhaps of something else, just because the slave owner is given the benefit of the doubt in a civil context, that doesn't mean that on Judgment Day, God doesn't really know what's happening and God doesn't judge him for his sin. I think we need to understand this. So when I look at the overall teaching of the Old Testament on slavery, I personally don't see any major issues. But let me know what you think in the comments section of the video. So I hope you like this video. If you have, please consider subscribing. Give me a thumbs up. Hit the bell notification button. I'll see you in the comments section and you'll see me in my next video.